1429, the Siege of Orleans. A young peasant girl and a young knight fight side by side. The girl, Jeanne d'Arc, claims to hear the voice of God. The knight, Gilles de Rais, becomes her most loyal protector. Together they save France. Together they become heroes. 1431, Rouen. Jeanne burns at the stake. Gilles is forced to watch. He cannot save her. Something breaks inside him in that moment. From 1432 onwards, children begin disappearing from villages across the Loire Valley. At first, no one makes the connection. Then the numbers grow. 10, 20, 50, 100. All from poor families. All blonde, blue-eyed, bearing features similar to Jeanne. Gilles is searching for them. But why? Is he trying to save them? Is he looking for Jeanne in their faces? Or is he taking out his rage at God through them? The truth is darker than either. And the story I'm about to tell you reveals how thin the line is between hero and monster, how trauma transforms people, and how power turns the darkest fantasies into reality. Before diving into this forgotten story of heroism corrupted into horror, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared need to understand humanity's capacity for both greatness and unspeakable evil. To understand the monster, we must first understand the hero. Gilles de Rais was born in 1405 into one of the wealthiest noble families in France. His full title stretched across multiple territories: Baron de Rais, Lord of Laval, Count of Brienne. His family's wealth was almost incomprehensible, owning vast estates across Brittany and beyond. But wealth couldn't protect him from childhood trauma that would shape everything that followed. When Gilles was 11, his parents died within months of each other, his father in a hunting accident, his mother from fever. He and his younger brother René were sent to live with their maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man whose cruelty was legendary even in an age that accepted violence as normal. De Craon saw his grandsons not as children to be loved but as assets to be exploited. He arranged marriages for both boys while they were still in early adolescence, political unions designed to consolidate the family's already massive holdings. Gilles was married at 16 to Catherine de Thouars, a distant cousin. It was a loveless arrangement, purely transactional. Catherine brought more land, more titles, more wealth, but she also brought something else, a witness to what Gilles would eventually become. She would later testify that even in those early years, there was something wrong with her husband, an emptiness behind his eyes that no amount of wealth or status could fill. By his early 20s, Gilles had inherited the full extent of the family fortune, becoming one of the richest men in France. He owned dozens of castles, hundreds of villages, and commanded private armies larger than most European monarchs could muster. He lived in spectacular luxury, hosting elaborate theatrical productions in his castles, maintaining a private chapel with a choir of 40 priests, and spending money with such abandon that even other nobles thought him excessive. But all the wealth and all the distractions couldn't fill the void inside him. Gilles was searching for something: meaning, purpose, redemption for a childhood stolen by death and exploitation. He found it, or thought he did, in 1427 when he met Jeanne d'Arc. Jeanne was 17, a peasant girl from Domremy who claimed to hear the voices of saints telling her to save France from English occupation. In any sane world, she would have been dismissed as a lunatic. But France in 1427 wasn't a sane world. The 100 Years' War had devastated the country. The English controlled most of northern France, and the French king was weak and indecisive. Desperate times make people listen to desperate voices. Gilles was assigned to serve as Jeanne's protector and military commander. It should have been a humiliating assignment for a proud noble, taking orders from an illiterate peasant girl. But something about Jeanne captivated Gilles completely. Perhaps it was her absolute certainty, the unwavering conviction that God spoke directly to her. Perhaps it was her purity, a quality so foreign to Giles's world of political calculation and moral compromise that it seemed almost supernatural. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps Jeanne saw something good in Gilles, treated him as more than just a wealthy noble, and for the first time in his life he felt truly seen. For 2 years, they were inseparable. Gilles fought at Jeanne's side through every major battle of her campaign. He was there at Orleans when they broke the siege. He was there at Patay when they crushed the English forces. He was there at Reims when Charles VII was crowned King of France. Jeanne called Gilles my gentle knight and trusted him completely. For Gilles, this period represented the only time in his life when he felt his existence had genuine purpose. Contemporary accounts describe Gilles during this period as almost transformed. The bored, dissolute noble became a fierce warrior and devoted protector. He spent his own fortune funding Jeanne's campaigns when the king's treasury ran dry. He stood between her and danger countless times. He genuinely loved her, not romantically perhaps, but with the desperate devotion of someone who has finally found something worth believing in. But belief is dangerous when it's invested entirely in another person, because people die, and when they do, belief can curdle into something far darker. May 30th, 1431, Place du Vieux-Marquet in Rouen. Jeanne d'Arc is burned at the stake for heresy. She's 19 years old. Gilles is there, forced to watch from the crowd, powerless to intervene. The English have made sure of that. Guards surround him specifically to prevent any rescue attempt. He watches the girl who gave his life meaning, who saw him as something more than his wealth and title, die screaming in the flames. Contemporary witnesses reported that Gilles wept openly, that he tried multiple times to break through the guards, that he had to be physically restrained. As the fire consumed Jeanne's body, something inside Gilles de Rais died as well. The man who rode away from Rouen that day was not the same man who had arrived. What happened next is documented in terrible detail, thanks to the trial records that would eventually bring Gilles to justice. But those records don't capture the gradual nature of his descent. Gilles didn't immediately become a monster. The transformation took time, progressing through stages that make his eventual crimes even more horrifying because they suggest deliberation rather than sudden madness. Stage 1 was depression and withdrawal. Gilles returned to his estates and essentially disappeared from public life. He stopped attending court, stopped involving himself in military affairs, stopped doing anything except brooding in his castles. He commissioned elaborate theatrical productions about Jeanne, paying actors to recreate her victories, hiring artists to paint her image on every available wall. His obsession with her memory became all-consuming. Stage 2 was financial desperation. Gillis's spending had always been excessive, but now it became truly insane. He was trying to fill the void left by Jeanne's death with ever more elaborate distractions. The theatrical productions grew more expensive and frequent. He expanded his private chapel until it rivaled cathedrals, hiring additional priests and choir members. He gave away land and money to anyone who reminded him even vaguely of Jeanne. Within 3 years of her death, he had burned through half his enormous fortune. Stage 3 was the turn to alchemy and black magic. As his money dwindled, Gilles became desperate to replenish it. He began consulting with alchemists who claimed they could turn lead into gold. When that failed, he turned to darker practitioners, sorcerers who promised him wealth through demonic pacts. This is where the historical record becomes particularly disturbing because these occult practices required sacrifices. And Gilles was no longer constrained by normal moral boundaries. The first child disappeared in late 1432 or early 1433. We don't know his name. Most of the victims' names are lost to history because they came from families too poor and powerless to document their losses. What we do know is that he was around 8 years old, blonde, with delicate features. He was taken from a village near one of Gillis's estates. His parents told that the baron needed choir boys for his chapel and would pay well. The child arrived at Tiffauges Castle, Gillis's primary residence in Brittany. He was given fine clothes, good food, and treated well for the first few days. Then he was taken to the lower chambers, the rooms that existed below the main castle, carved from rock and designed to be soundproof. What happened in those chambers would be repeated with horrifying regularity over the next 8 years. Gillis's servants, who later testified at his trial, described a systematic pattern. Children would be lured or purchased from nearby villages. The baron preferred boys but occasionally took girls, always between ages 6 and 16, always from poor families who could be convinced that their children were being given opportunities for advancement. The children would arrive at the castle, be bathed and dressed in fine clothes, and then brought before Gilles. What followed varied slightly with each victim, but certain elements remained constant. Gilles would talk to them gently at first, asking about their families, their dreams, putting them at ease. He seemed to take particular pleasure in this initial phase, in seeing trust and hope in their eyes before he destroyed it. Then would come the transition, so sudden and shocking that most victims couldn't process what was happening until it was too late. The trial records, preserved in the archives of Nantes, contain testimony so disturbing that parts remain sealed even today. But what is publicly available describes a pattern of torture, sexual abuse, and murder that defies comprehension. Gilles didn't kill quickly or efficiently. He prolonged the suffering, seeming to derive pleasure from every moment of his victims' terror and pain. His primary accomplices were 2 servants, Henriette Griart and Etienne Correlot, known as Poitou. These men helped procure victims, assisted in the abuse, and disposed of bodies. Their testimony at the trial provides the most detailed account of what happened in those underground chambers. They described how Gilles would sometimes spend hours with a single victim, alternating between gentleness and extreme violence, creating psychological torture that was almost worse than the physical. But here's what makes the story even more tragic and complex. According to the testimony, Gilles would often weep after killing his victims. He would hold their bodies and cry, apologizing to them, to God, to Jeanne's memory. Then he would have the bodies burned or buried in secret locations around his estates, and within days or weeks, he would send his servants to find new victims. The cycle repeated endlessly, driven by compulsions Gilles himself seemed unable to control or even fully understand. Some historians have theorized that Gilles was trying to save these children in his own twisted way. Most of his victims bore some resemblance to Jeanne: blonde hair, blue eyes, delicate features. Perhaps in his damaged mind, he was trying to recreate the moment of Jeanne's death to somehow gain control over it by reenacting it with substitutes. Perhaps he believed that by sacrificing these innocents, he could bring Jeanne back or earn demonic power that would allow him to resurrect her. Or perhaps, most disturbing of all, he was simply punishing God by destroying the innocent souls God supposedly cherished. The numbers grew steadily. By 1435, at least 40 children had disappeared. By 1437, the count exceeded 100. By 1440, when Gilles was finally arrested, the number had reached at least 140, though his own confession suggested the true total might be closer to 800. Even accounting for medieval exaggeration, we're talking about one of the most prolific serial killers in record. How did he get away with it for so long? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about power and privilege that remain relevant today. Gilles was extraordinarily wealthy and well-connected. He had provided essential military service to the king. His family had political influence across multiple regions. And most importantly, his victims came from the lowest social classes, peasant families with no power to demand investigations or justice. When parents complained that their children had disappeared after being taken to serve at the baron's castle, local authorities dismissed their concerns. Rich nobles didn't kidnap peasant children. The children had probably run away or died of disease or been taken by bandits. The few officials who took the complaints seriously found themselves pressured by Gilles's allies to drop their investigations. It was easier to ignore the mounting evidence than to accuse one of France's greatest war heroes of unthinkable crimes. But even the most powerful men eventually make mistakes. Gilles's downfall began not with his murders but with a property dispute. In his desperation for money, he had sold several estates to the church. Then, in a fit of rage over some perceived slight, he led armed men into a church during Mass and physically assaulted a priest who had taken possession of one of those properties. This was a crime that even Gilles's wealth and status couldn't protect him from. You didn't violate church sanctuary and attack clergy without consequences. The Bishop of Nantes, Jeanne de Malestroit, ordered Gilles's arrest on charges of sacrilege. But once they had him in custody, once they started investigating his affairs, the whispers and rumors that had been circulating for years suddenly demanded attention. Parents came forward with stories of children promised positions in the baron's household who never returned. Former servants began talking about strange sounds from the lower chambers, about mysterious midnight burials, about unexplained bloodstains and horrifying discoveries. The investigation expanded rapidly. Bishop Malestroit ordered searches of Gilles's properties. At Tiffauges Castle, they found the chambers where the murders had taken place, walls bearing marks that suggested violent struggles, implements that had no innocent explanation, and most damning of all, a chest containing the clothing and belongings of dozens of children. At other properties, they found burial sites. Bodies were unearthed from gardens, from cellars, from hidden chambers. The remains confirmed the worst suspicions, evidence of torture, sexual abuse, and violent death. Some bodies were so badly mutilated or burned that identification was impossible. Others were preserved enough to match descriptions of specific missing children. Gilles was formally charged on August 29, 1440, with murder, sodomy, heresy, and invoking demons. The trial began in October at Nantes. It would become one of the most sensational proceedings in medieval history, drawing crowds from across France who couldn't believe that a national hero stood accused of such monstrous crimes. Initially, Gilles refused to cooperate. He denied everything, claiming the charges were fabricated by enemies jealous of his wealth and fame. He raged at the judges, threatened them with powerful allies, and insisted that, as a baron, he couldn't be tried by ecclesiastical courts. His arrogance was breathtaking, the same arrogance that had allowed him to commit his crimes for so long, the belief that power placed him above all accountability. But the evidence was overwhelming. One by one, witnesses testified. Parents identified clothing and belongings found at Gilles's properties. Former servants described in horrifying detail what they had witnessed and participated in. Henriette and Poitou, Gilles's primary accomplices, provided comprehensive testimony in exchange for promises of quick executions rather than prolonged torture. The testimony was so disturbing that the judges had to repeatedly pause the proceedings. Several times, the bishop ordered portions of testimony testimony stricken from the official record because they were too graphic for public consumption. Even in an age accustomed to violence, what Gilles had done shocked medieval sensibilities to their core. Finally, faced with irrefutable evidence and the testimony of his own servants, Gilles broke. On October 21, 1440, he confessed, and his confession was perhaps more disturbing than anything his servants had described because it revealed not a madman who didn't understand his actions, but a man who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. "It is true," Gilles told the court, "that I took delight in watching them die. I found pleasure in their suffering, in their fear, in the final moment when life left their eyes. I knew it was wrong. I knew God condemned it. I knew society would punish me if discovered. But the pleasure was greater than the fear of consequences." He admitted to at least 140 murders, though he claimed he had stopped counting precisely because the numbers meant nothing to him. He described his methods in clinical detail, showing no remorse, only a kind of academic interest in explaining his process. He talked about how he selected victims, how he gained their trust, how he prolonged their suffering, all with the detached manner of someone discussing a hobby rather than mass murder. The court asked if he felt any guilt. Gilles paused, then said something that has echoed through history. "I felt guilt only when I thought of Jeanne. She would have been disappointed in me. But Jeanne is dead, and the dead cannot judge. Only God can judge, and God has already taken from me everything I cared about. What more can he do?" This answer reveals something crucial about Gilles' psychology. His crimes weren't motivated by sexual desire alone, though that was certainly part of it. They were motivated by rage at God for taking Jeanne, rage at a world that had failed to protect innocence, rage at his own powerlessness to save the one person who had given his life meaning. He was punishing God by destroying the innocent, creating suffering as a form of protest against a universe he saw as fundamentally unjust. But there was also the pleasure he admitted to taking in the suffering itself. This is what separates Gilles from tragic figures who commit crimes from grief or trauma. He enjoyed what he did. He sought it out repeatedly. He developed increasingly elaborate methods of torture because simple murder no longer satisfied him. He had become, in the most literal sense, a monster who fed on the pain of children. The sentence was never in doubt. Gilles de Rais was found guilty on all charges. The punishment would be execution, but the manner of execution sparked debate. Some wanted him burned as a heretic. Others wanted him drawn and quartered as a traitor. Ultimately, the court decided on hanging followed by burning, but made a crucial exception. Because Gilles confessed and showed what the court interpreted as genuine repentance, though modern readers of the trial records might question how genuine it truly was, he was allowed to be strangled to death before his body was burned. This was considered a mercy, allowing him to die quickly rather than suffering in the flames. His two primary accomplices, Henriette and Poitou, received the same consideration. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was executed in Nantes. Thousands gathered to watch. Contemporary accounts describe a surreal scene. The man who had been France's hero, who had fought beside Jeanne d'Arc, who had been celebrated in songs and stories, now hung from a gallows like a common criminal. His body was then burned to ashes, and those ashes were scattered, ensuring that no shrine could be built to memorialize him. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite his own confession, despite the testimony of dozens of witnesses, some people refused to believe Gilles was guilty. A cult of denial emerged almost immediately, claiming he had been framed by jealous enemies who coveted his wealth. These deniers pointed to the fact that the church seized all of Gilles' properties after his execution, suggesting financial motives for false accusations. This denial has persisted, in varying forms, for nearly 600 years. Even today, there are historians and writers who argue that Gilles de Rais was innocent, that his confession was coerced, that the evidence was fabricated. They point to inconsistencies in witness testimony, to the possibility of torture during interrogation, to the political benefits his enemies gained from his downfall. But the evidence is overwhelming and comes from too many independent sources to be fabricated. The bodies found at his properties, the testimony of servants who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by telling the truth, the detailed confession that included information only the killer would know, and perhaps most damningly, the pattern of disappearances that began after Jeanne's death and ended only when Gilles was arrested. The denial of Gilles' guilt reveals something important about how we process evil. We want to believe that heroes can't become monsters, that the people who do great things must be fundamentally good. We want clear lines between the righteous and the wicked, between the saviors and the devils. Gilles de Rais shatters those comfortable categories. He was both hero and monster, capable of genuine courage and devotion, and also capable of unspeakable cruelty. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. Can trauma transform someone completely? Was the darkness always inside him, merely waiting for circumstances to release it? Or did watching Jeanne burn create something new in him, something that hadn't existed before? Is evil something people are born with or something they become? The victims of Gilles de Rais deserve to be remembered as more than statistics in a horror story. Each one was a person with dreams and fears, with families who loved them, with futures that were stolen. Most of their names are lost to history because they came from families too poor to leave written records. But they were real children who suffered real terror and real pain at the hands of a man who had sworn to protect the innocent. Think about the 8-year-old boy from that first village, whose name we don't even know. He probably felt excited when the Baron's men arrived, offering him a chance to sing in a great lord's chapel. He probably imagined the future this opportunity would create, maybe becoming a priest, maybe earning enough to help his family, maybe just having regular meals for the first time in his life. Instead, he became the first victim in a killing spree that would span 8 years and claim hundreds of lives. Or think about the parents of these children, most of whom never learned the truth about what happened to their sons and daughters. They spent the rest of their lives wondering, hoping, imagining that maybe their child had run away to a better life, or been taken in by a kind stranger, or simply gotten lost and couldn't find their way home. The truth would have been more terrible than any uncertainty, but at least truth provides closure. These parents had neither truth nor closure, only absence and eternal questions. The case of Gilles de Rais became a cautionary tale that echoed through European culture for centuries. It inspired the Bluebeard fairy tale, the story of a wealthy nobleman who murders his wives and hides their bodies in a secret chamber. It influenced countless other stories about aristocratic predators who use their power and wealth to prey on the vulnerable. It became shorthand for a particular kind of evil, the evil of privilege weaponized against innocence. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Gilles de Rais is what his story reveals about the nature of heroism and villainy. He genuinely was a hero during his time with Jeanne d'Arc. The courage he showed in battle was real. The loyalty he demonstrated was genuine. The good he did for France was substantial. None of that is negated by what came later, but neither does it excuse or explain it. This is what makes his story so deeply disturbing. We want to believe that heroes and villains are distinct categories, that you can identify evil by obvious signs and good by clear markers. But Gilles was celebrated and decorated, loved and admired, while secretly committing atrocities that defied imagination. He could be gentle with his own children while torturing someone else's child to death in his basement. He could weep over Jeanne's martyrdom while creating hundreds of new martyrs through his own actions. The disconnect between public persona and private reality is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. Respected pillars of the community revealed as predators. Beloved celebrities discovered to be monsters. Authority figures who abuse the very people they're supposed to protect. Gilles de Rais was perhaps the first such figure to be thoroughly documented, but he was far from the last. His story also reveals how wealth and power create protective shields that allow evil to flourish. For 8 years, Gilles operated with impunity because he was too rich, too connected, too important to be seriously investigated. His victims were too poor, too powerless, too insignificant for their disappearances to trigger meaningful response. Only when he made the mistake of attacking church property did the shield of privilege finally crack. This pattern persists today. How many modern predators operate behind shields of wealth, fame, or institutional protection? How many victims are ignored or dismissed because they lack social power? How many crimes go unpunished because the perpetrators are deemed too important to prosecute? The mechanisms change, but the dynamic remains the same. The children who died at Tiffauges Castle died not just because one man was evil, but because an entire system valued some lives more than others. They died because powerful men could do whatever they wanted to powerless people. They died because their suffering was invisible to those who had the power to stop it. They died, ultimately, because their lives were considered disposable. When Gilles de Rais was executed in 1440, French society breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster was dead. Justice was served. Order was restored. But nothing had actually changed in the systems that allowed his crimes. The social hierarchies that made children vulnerable remained intact. The concentration of power without accountability continued. Within years, other nobles were committing similar crimes, perhaps more discreetly, but enabled by the same structural inequalities. The legacy of Gilles de Rais isn't just the horror of what one man did. It's the reminder that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs. It wears familiar faces. It hides behind accomplishments and status. It exploits the exact same systems that are supposed to protect us. And most disturbingly, it can emerge from people who once seemed capable of genuine heroism and virtue. If you take away anything from this story, let it be this: heroism and monstrosity are not opposite ends of a spectrum. They're separate qualities that can coexist in the same person. person. Yesterday's hero can become tomorrow's villain. The person who saves lives in one context can destroy them in another. This doesn't mean we should be cynical about heroism or dismiss genuine good deeds. It means we should never stop watching, never stop questioning, never assume that power and prestige automatically correlate with moral virtue. And we should remember the victims, not as numbers or statistics, not as footnotes in the biography of their killer, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose suffering was real, whose absence left holes in the fabric of their families and communities. The boy whose name we don't know. The girl who was too young to understand what was happening. The teenager who fought back and died fighting. The child who trusted because children are designed to trust adults, especially adults who present themselves as protectors and benefactors. Their names are mostly lost, but their humanity shouldn't be. They were children who deserved to grow up, to fall in love, to make mistakes and learn from them, to discover who they were meant to become. Gilles de Rais stole all of that from them. And while his name survives in infamy, there should survive as a memorial to innocence destroyed and a warning about the eternal vigilance required to protect the vulnerable from those who would harm them. The marble halls of Tiffauges Castle still stand, converted over centuries into other uses, eventually falling into picturesque ruin. Tourists visit without knowing the full horror of what happened in the chambers beneath their feet. The Loire Valley villages that lost their children have forgotten which families suffered those losses. Time has done what it always does, softened the edges of horror until it becomes merely history, something to be studied with academic detachment rather than felt with visceral horror. But the screams that echoed through those stone chambers 600 years ago should not be forgotten. The terror those children felt should not be diminished by time's passage. The evil that Gilles de Rais embodied should not be reduced to colorful anecdote or psychological curiosity. This was real. It happened, and it continues to happen in different forms wherever power concentrates without accountability, wherever privilege shields predators, wherever society decides that some lives matter more than others. Remember Gilles de Rais not as a monster from a safely distant past, but as a warning that remains eternally relevant. Remember his victims not as names in a historical document, but as children who deserved better. And remember that the line between hero and horror, between protector and predator, between savior and destroyer, is thinner than we like to believe. The knight who rode beside Jeanne d'Arc became the monster who murdered 140 children. Both are true. Both happened. And until we can hold both truths simultaneously without resorting to denial or simplification, we'll never fully understand the complexity of human evil or the vigilance required to prevent it.